Welcome to another episode of the Ink and Impact podcast. I'm your host, Daleen Bickle, and I am so excited to have my friend Becca Wierwille on the show with me. And so, Becca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Daleen.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I am so excited to talk to you about this topic of how to incorporate your own experience into a fictional story and why it matters. So, as the listeners heard on the introduction, you wrote a middle grade fiction novel, Road Trip Rescue. And so let's just start there. Is that based on your own personal experience?
Yeah, so Road Trip Rescue is the story of a 12-year-old girl named Kimmy, and she goes off on a road trip in search of her long lost dog. And it's interesting because her experience is similar to mine in some ways and very different from others. And as I was initially writing the first draft, I wasn't thinking about it with my own experience in mind in some ways. In other ways, I was. So, for example, when I was crafting Kimmy's character, something she struggles with is anxiety, and she asks a lot of what if questions. And so, as this road trip adventure is in front of her, and she's not sure if she has the courage to do it, and she's asking all these what if questions, I did find myself reflecting on my experience to questions that I might have asked when I was that age and to anxieties that I've had. But when I wrote the first draft, Kimmy did not share the biggest thing in common with me, which is the limb difference that we now share in common. So both Kimmy and I were born missing half of our right arm. So my arm and Kimmy's arm ends right below the elbow. And the first draft, she did not have a limb difference. But after I finished that first draft, I realized she needed a really compelling reason that she wanted to go after this dog. It couldn't just be a dog. The dog had to matter a lot to her. And there had to be some sort of backstory that made that important. And so I started thinking about my own childhood and how there were times when I felt like I could trust my dog more than I could trust people. And I remember I had a dog when I was Kimmy's age, and I thought, even if she could talk, she would never say anything bad about my arm or bad about me in general. Um, Dogs love us so wholeheartedly. And so as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, what if Kimmy also had a limb difference? And what if she had had maybe a friend betray her? And I never had a friend betray me in the same way as what happened to Kimmy in her story. But as I started to think about that, it would make sense that this dog would matter to her more than just a dog. It was a friend and a family member and someone she could trust and go to with her problems. And so adding in that limb difference came in, I don't know, second draft, third draft as I was revising. But it was really cool to then be able to take more of my experiences and put them into the story as I was revising.
Oh, that there's so much to unpack here. So first of all, I think it's really wonderful that you realized that there needed to be some compelling reason, right? A lot of times, I know for me, whenever I'm writing that first draft, I'm like, okay, it's done, right?
Mm-hmm.
But especially in fiction, we really need to stop and think about what's the reader going to get out of this, right? And will they make that connection? And having that compelling limb difference, it's really going to cause a lot of readers to sit up and take notice because I know in my circle, I'm not familiar with people with limb differences. So I think this is opening up a really great conversation for a lot of people. Have you experienced that?
I have. Yeah, it seems like one, people in the limb difference community are really excited about it because there's not a whole lot of stories out there that feature a character with a limb difference. And I can even remember when I was growing up, it would be cool to read a story where there's a character like you or that has something common with you. And I didn't see that a lot. So I always had it in the back of my mind that, oh, this would be a fun story to write. But then for people outside of this community, and even for people who I know who have grown up with me, it's a unique way for them to get an insight toward some of the thoughts that might have been going on in my mind or might be going on in the mind of someone who has a limb difference or another physical difference. And then beyond that, even there are these universal feelings that go along with it. So Kimmy has these feelings of loss related to Bo, her dog, and then also these feelings of loneliness that relate to her limb difference. So feeling different from those around her. And so, even for readers who don't have a limb difference or a physical difference, they probably can relate on some level to her loneliness and to the way she feels different and to the way she feels insecure. So when we can take our own experiences that feel so visceral to us and so unique to us and put them into our story, we're actually creating potentially stronger connection points for our readers because those feelings of underlying themes like loss and loneliness become more vivid in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. That's so good. So have you had any feedback from young readers about this in
I
particular, or are
have.
you hearing more from the parents?
I've heard from both. Now, I it's definitely so much fun when I get to hear directly from a kid who's read it. One of my favorite emails I think I've ever gotten was from a girl who read my story, and I had pre-launched the book through a Kickstarter campaign several months ahead of the actual release. So she read an early copy, and she emailed me and said that she had recently had to rehome her cat. So prior to reading this book where Kimmy had lost her dog, she had lost her cat. And so off the bat, she had a way that she was really relating to Kimmy through the story. Then she said, as she read, she really related to Kimmy's feelings of loneliness and through it all related to realizing that God was with her all the way through. And so that touched my heart so much. And I honestly, I'm amazed at how God can use our stories, our fictional stories, to reach the hearts of readers wherever they are. And the fact that different readers get different things, but that met her right where she was and being able to see that God is with her, even though she did have to rehome this cat. And even though that did bring with it feelings of loneliness and I'm sure frustration and other emotions as well. So that was one of my favorite emails to receive directly from a reader. And I have heard from parents as well. A lot of my reviews are from parents. Probably all of my reviews are from either the parents, the grandparents, whoever was reading it with their kids. And I had comments about it making their kids think, helping their kids feel seen and loved, challenging them to think about how they react to people around them and situations, and then just general lessons of learning to be a good friend and trusting God and caring less about what other people think. So things like that are some of the feedback I've gotten.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow. So that just, I'm sure, is so it's so compelling to you, but also what a way to honor God, right? Because I'm guessing that this was a story that God led you to write. Am I
Yes.
correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. So one of my other questions was, what led you to write middle grade fiction in particular? Was it that calling?
Yeah. Well, I love middle grade fiction, first of all. And I think as I reflect back on the stories that God used to work in my life, those are stories that come to mind. The stories that I read when I was in that 8 to 12-ish age range. It's such a transformational time in a child's life. And so I think about those stories. And I had been writing all the way through, but after my husband and I got married is when I started really diving into the publishing industry and trying to learn more. And I couldn't figure out what I wanted to write. I was all over the place writing different genres. And then I wrote a story and it was almost on the verge of memoir. It was very, very much based on my experience and actually my dog I had and my arm. So it had all of those things. And that story has not been published, and I don't think it will ever be anywhere other than on my computer for the best. But all that to say, as I was writing that story, I really felt God's call to write more stories like this and to reach out to this age group. And the voice resonated with me. And around that time or soon after, I also taught kindergarten. So I taught kindergarten for 4 years. And those kids are younger than middle grade, but still being in that school setting and being around kids and realizing what an important time that is. Um,
Absolutely.
and so, yeah, I think through that, I could feel God nudging me in this direction to write middle grade. And I am just so humbled by the way he has worked through these stories and the way that he leads me. Because when I started writing Road Trip Rescue, it was nothing like the story it is now. And we talked about how I added in the limb difference aspect later, but the ways it changed along the way and the people it's reached, I know none of it would be possible without his guidance and his leading. So I am so thankful and humbled by how he's worked.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, so good. So good. So we've kind of addressed, why it matters about incorporating our story because, we can relate to others, we can help them in a time of need, we can resonate with them, all of those things that you've shared already. But how do we actually incorporate our personal experiences into our story? Do you have any tips for how to do that?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say would be to invite God into the process and ask Him for help. Ask Him to show you experiences in your life or specific feelings you've had that are tied to different events and how you might use those in a fictional story you're writing. Because if we do it on our own, it's not going to go anywhere. I mean, it's so important to have him on your team and to not be doing it alone and to invite him to write the story with you and to create alongside him is such a gift. So that would be my first step. And then as you're inviting him into the process, to pray about how your experiences might bring hope to the lives of others, might help them feel understood or connected to. I think so often we can have an experience or an emotion that makes us feel really isolated. And we think, well, no one else has ever felt this way, or I'm alone in this thing that happened. But if we've ever felt isolated in these experiences, so have others. And if we can bring those experiences to life through a fictional story, a child or an adult or whatever genre you're writing might pick up that story and start reading it. And then all of a sudden, they don't feel so isolated anymore. And so, seeking out those experiences that have been hard for us are ones that we maybe haven't felt comfortable talking about in the past or reflecting on, diving deeper into those things and seeing how it might come to life in a fictional story can be really important and really cool. And then another tip I would say would be as you're crafting a character, to make sure the character still has its own story separate from your own. Because a danger in craft and in writing fiction can be to have all characters who are very much like yourself. And then it tends to feel like all the characters are talking to each other, but they all sound kind of like you. And it can be a little irritating to the reader. So making sure they're different and unique and have their own stories, but also adding in hints of your own experience, whether that's anxiety or loss or whatever it is. So, like I mentioned with Kimmy, she has her own story. And so it's fun for me to be able to talk to readers and say, okay, these are ways that Kimmy and I share in common with our stories. And these are things that are different. So, those would be some of the first things that come to mind when you talk about incorporating it into a story.
Oh, so good. And of course, I completely agree about starting with God first and foremost. And so as I was listening to you, I was kind of thinking, one of my questions had been, is there such a thing as oversharing? And I
Mm.
think that you've kind of addressed that in a roundabout way, in that you said that you first wrote your own basic memoir first, and then you decided it's not going to be shown to anybody, right? But you got it out. It was probably oversharing, if you were to just put it out there in the public, but you got it out there, you got the thoughts going, you invited God in, and I'm guessing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that God led you to know how much is too much and where to stop. Am I correct in that?
I think you're correct. And I've never even really thought about that, honestly. But it's cool to think that that was the first story I wrote in the middle grade genre, was the one that was almost like memoir. And then the one that I first published, and there was a lot in between there. But the one that I first published, Road Trip Rescue, did have a lot in common with that. It was the first middle grade story I'd written since then that had a character with a limb difference. It also was the first, I believe, the first one I'd written that also had a dog as in the main story concept. So it had a lot in common, but it also was very different. So it's really cool how God used that whole time frame as I was writing other things to kind of teach me and show me what to share, what to keep. And when you talk about why the stories matter, I mean, as we're ministering to the hearts of others, we are also ministering to our own hearts, and we're giving ourselves a voice, and we're learning about ourselves. And some of that I think is just for us. It's like when
Yeah.
you write in a journal, you're not writing in a journal to read it out loud to others. You're writing it
Right.
down to see how God's been working in your life and to put words to your experience and to maybe see things in ways that you hadn't before.
Oh, so good. So good. I love all of that. Oh. So, practically speaking, if someone is thinking of writing their first fictional story, maybe they've written lots of nonfiction, or maybe they haven't written anything at all, what would you say is the biggest tip for just getting started?
Well, just getting started, my biggest tip I always go back to, and this isn't even necessarily the writing, but just surrounding yourself with others.
Mm,
Having other writers around you who understand the process, who understand what you're trying to do, because the people in our lives, they love us dearly. But if they're not authors, it's just not in their world. They're just not part of what they do. So finding maybe a writing organization or a critique group or just an accountability group with other writers where you can meet together and you can talk about what you're trying to do and you can share resources like this podcast. I mean, being able to listen to podcasts and read books and do research, all of that stuff I feel like is so helpful and so important into being able to build up to being able to write your story. But then when it comes to incorporating your own experience into a story, I'd say maybe two things. So, first, decide if you're wanting to write exactly your experience or if you're wanting to kind of insert your experience into a story, because that is the difference between like memoir, like I had mentioned, and between fiction. So, being able to use our experience in smaller ways and inserting into a story kind of gives an ability to write different types of stories and to continue writing different fictional stories that all include parts of your story. Whereas writing it all down in a memoir, that's just a different sort of thing. So I guess identifying your goals would be a more basic way to put that. And
Excellent.
then the other thing I'd say is to maybe just start journaling about your experience that you want to maybe write about. And as you're journaling about that experience, start praying about how God would have you share it. Start praying about, is this a fictional story? Is this nonfiction? Is it maybe a devotion that I'm going to use to share some of my story along the way in smaller parts? There are so many different ways that we can share our stories and put our words out there. So I think praying and seeking discernment and wisdom for the best way to do that is important.
For sure. And I was just thinking too that so many people have been through really, really tough experiences, right? And there's a lot of processing that has to go through
Mm-hmm.
your mind before I think it's ready to be shared. And so
Mm-hmm.
to be in prayer about, is this the time to write this publicly, or is this just the time to document it and journal it
Mm-hmm.
and all that? Um, because I don't know if you have experienced this, but I have read some books that are almost, I feel like too much information. I'm almost embarrassed for the writer because I'm like, oh, I don't need to know all of that.
Mm.
It makes the reader uncomfortable if you're not
Yeah.
on necessarily in a place to share it. Um, Generally, you want to be on
Mm-hmm.
the other side of that
Yeah.
um, situation and have had time to um, learn certain lessons or come at it from a perspective where you can see two sides of the story.
Yeah, I think the creation journey itself can be so healing for our hearts. And so, if we're taking something and sharing it from the middle of that process of healing where we haven't yet healed, like you said, where we're not yet on the other side and where our hearts are still tender and hurting, and we're not able to see a situation from both sides, as you mentioned, I think that can be hard. And I think you're right. It can be uncomfortable for readers. I had mentioned that I spent a lot of time jumping through different genres and experimenting with different types of writing before settling on middle grade. And I did spend a lot of time writing some nonfiction. And I actually have a couple of manuscripts. And the one I even took with me to a writer's conference. And now I look back at that and I'm like, oh my goodness, I was so in the middle of my healing journey and trying to figure out how God had worked in my life. And I am so thankful that that story is not out in the world for anyone to read now, because I'm thankful that I wrote it. And I love being able to look back on it now and see those thoughts and see how God was working. But it's not necessarily something that I would have wanted anyone else to read.
Right. Oh, so good. So good. So one of the things you kind of touched on too at the beginning was about getting the feedback from readers. But when you set out to write the book and you're, hitting the upload button to launch it out into the public, what were your hopes and goals for the book? Like, how did you want to impact others through this book?
Well, that's a good question. I think part of at the launch, like building up to the launch. So before in those times, like with the Kickstarter campaign and sending out early copies, it was just exciting. And I knew that the theme in the story that I wanted to convey to readers, outside of enjoying the adventure and having fun with Kimmy on her journey, was to show them that they were not alone because God was always with them in what they were going through. And also to show that they are wonderfully created for the unique adventures in their lives. That's part of my author brand. I love to write stories that show readers that they're wonderfully created. So that was in my head the whole time. And then as I got close to the actual launch, it was last October, there was this buildup of, I don't know how to call it, pressure or overwhelm or anxiety, just like, oh my goodness, I'm really doing this. I'm really putting this out there for anyone to read, and knowing that it does contain parts of my story that are really close to my heart. It was a scary thing in ways I didn't expect. And even now, as I prepare for book two, there's vulnerability and it's scary. But I think that my biggest goal would be that, or my biggest prayer, maybe would be a better word, would be that God would continue to place it in the hands of readers, whether that's kids or even adults. I've had some feedback from adults who feel like it's really spoken to them as well, that God will continue to help them find the story, and that through it, they might find hope and maybe healing, that they would feel less alone, that maybe people who haven't spent time in church lately or haven't really thought about how God is actively working in their lives, that they would be able to see that in new ways. Part of Kimmy's story, she goes through all these experiences and then she reflects back on it, and she can see how God has been working even when she didn't realize it at the time. And I think that's so often the case in our lives. We go about our daily lives and our adventures, and there are things that are captivating our attention, and we're not really noticing the small ways and the big ways that God is orchestrating things in our lives. So I think that would be my prayer. And my goal to go along with that prayer is that I would be faithful in continuing to write stories that convey these themes of faith, and that I would be able to continue to share them with readers. And seeking God to do that is also very important because marketing is hard.
Yes, it is, and ongoing.
Yes, yes, it is.
Oh, well, these have all been fabulous tips and encouragements and wonderful reminders about the goodness of God and how faithful He is when we turn to Him in our writing and in every aspect of our life, of course. Um, and especially, but as writers and authors, creating books, it's such a privilege, I think, to be
Mm,
able to reach so many people that we might not ever know
mm,
who all reads our words, whether it's on our social media feed, in a blog post, or in our books. But He has given us a calling to share His word, share the gospel, share His truths to others. And we all have slightly different um, ways of doing that. Like you're writing middle grade fiction. I'm currently writing historical fiction. There's so many different ways to do that. And one's not better than the other because we're all working together collectively as Christian writers to proclaim the good news and for His glory. So I just think that's so it's such a blessing, and it's so
mm.
exciting. It's exciting to
Yes,
see what He's doing.
I
Um,
agree.
yeah. So thank you for sharing all of these. But before we close, I always like to ask my guests, since most of us love to read as well, if there has been one book that has really impacted you in your life, either as a child or as an adult.
Well, I thought about this a lot because I knew you were going to ask it. And I actually have two books, if you don't mind. I don't know if that's breaking the rules too
That's
much.
okay. Almost everybody says I can only narrow it down to two.
Okay. And I had way more than two. I mean, this was narrowing it down. But I think when you talk about as a child or adult, that's what really sparked it in me because, again, those stories that I read when I was younger have really stuck with me. And so one of them, it's nonfiction. So, and speaking of like sharing our stories, this would be an example of someone who chose to share their story through nonfiction. So it is like memoir. It's Soul Surfer by Bethany Hamilton. And so that's the story of she was 13 when she lost her arm in a shark attack. So it's her story. And I was looking up when the book released because I can't quite remember when I would have read it. So it released in like mid 2000s. I'm guessing I read it when I was probably in middle school. And I just remember a few things. One, just the gift of seeing someone else who had one arm in a story. And it's very different because I was born with a limb different. She lost hers. So it's a very different thing, but just it's a gift to be able to see ourselves in some way in someone else's story. And two, her vulnerability. And we've talked about oversharing and not wanting to overshare, but also the fact that she was able to share a lot of what happened in a really beautiful way on the other side of it. was really cool to see. And just the example of courage that she set through the story too. That just
Yeah.
impacted me then. I still think about it a lot now. And then the other book, so these are different, these are very different types of books, which is why I felt like maybe it was okay. Um, the other book is You Are Special by Max Lucado. So a picture book. And I love the way it reminds us where to look for our worth, where to find our identity. And then it also, personally, I can feel connected to it from different times in my life, like childhood when I remember being read to. And then I worked as a camp counselor, and I would often read this book before we went to bed to the campers. So I can connect it with that time in my life. And then also teaching kindergarten. I taught kindergarten for 4 years, and I would always give this book as a gift at the end of the school year to the students. And so as I think about this story and I think about all the kids that I've had the privilege to meet, whether at camp or teaching or all these different times in my life, and I think of how God created all of us so uniquely, um, so wonderfully, and it's just an amazing, amazing gift. So those are the two that came to mind first.
Oh, those are fantastic recommendations. I am familiar with Bethany Hamilton's experience, but I've not read her book, so I might check that out as well. And I love that you shared a picture book because I don't think anyone on the podcast has shared that yet. And I love that because I too remember being read to as a young child, and I still enjoy picture books. I miss reading it to my grown boys now. So, I mean, adults get a lot out of picture books too. I think so.
Yes, I've been reading a
Yeah.
lot of picture books lately, and I can attest to that.
Yes. Yes. Oh, well, thank you so much, Becca, for joining us today. It has been a pleasure, and I wish you continued success as you prepare to release book two. Is it going to be like a continuation of Kimmy's story, or is it a totally separate book?
So, book two is kind of a continuation. It's in the same series. So, the Road Trip
Okay.
Rescue series is going to have 3 books, but book two is written from the perspective of her friend Daniel. So, it's a little bit different. But if anyone wants to follow along, my website is beccawierwille.com. And if you sign up for my newsletter list, that's the best way to get connected with me. I send some free resources, but also I'll be posting updates as the book prepares for Kickstarter pre launch in April and then launching in the summer after that.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I will, of course, include links in the show notes to everything that Becca has just mentioned about how to connect with her, because I'm sure you will want to. And yeah, just thank you again, Becca, for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Daleen.
Absolutely.